Welcome back to Timeless Thinkers, where history's greatest minds speak again and where we explore the ideas that shaped our world. I'm your host, and we've journeyed through a remarkable progression of political thought. Machiavelli showed us that power operates by its own ruthless logic, unconstrained by conventional morality. Hobbes argued that absolute sovereignty is necessary to escape the chaos and violence of the state of nature. Locke countered that natural rights and consent limit legitimate authority, giving people the right to overthrow governments that systematically violate their trust. Rousseau insisted the people themselves must remain permanently sovereign through direct democratic participation, never alienating their power to representatives. And Montesquieu designed the institutional machinery, separation of powers and checks and balances, that makes constitutional government work even when leaders aren't virtuous. But throughout this journey, we've been asking how government should be structured and who should rule. Today, we meet the philosopher who asked a more fundamental question: why? What moral foundation justifies any political authority at all? On what basis can government claim legitimacy? What makes any law binding on the conscience? This is the story of Immanuel Kant and how he made human dignity, grounded in rational autonomy, the moral foundation of all legitimate political order. His answer would transform political philosophy, ground the concept of universal human rights, and provide the ethical framework that underlies every modern declaration of rights and freedoms.
Immanuel Kant was born on April 22, 1724, in Königsberg, Prussia, a city he would never leave, yet from which he would change the entire world of philosophy. While Montesquieu traveled across Europe observing governments, and Rousseau wandered from city to city challenging civilization itself, Kant remained in his hometown, walking the same streets with such regularity that locals allegedly set their clocks by his daily walks. This might seem paradoxical. The man who revolutionized philosophy barely traveled beyond his birthplace. But Kant's revolution happened not through observation of the world, but through pure thought, through systematic analysis of the foundations of knowledge, morality, and political legitimacy. Kant came from modest circumstances. His father was a harness maker, his mother deeply religious in the pietist tradition that emphasized personal faith and moral discipline. This early exposure to rigorous ethical standards would profoundly influence his later philosophy, though he would ground morality in reason rather than religious faith. He studied at the University of Königsberg, becoming a private tutor for several years, before finally securing a position at the university in 1755. For the next 46 years, Kant would teach and write, producing some of the most difficult and influential works in the history of philosophy. But Kant's early career was relatively quiet. He wrote on various topics, natural science, metaphysics, aesthetics, without achieving major recognition. Then, in 1781, at age 57, he published The Critique of Pure Reason, a massive, dense, revolutionary work that attempted to resolve fundamental questions about what humans can know and how knowledge is possible. This was followed by The Critique of Practical Reason in 1788, which addressed morality, and The Critique of Judgment in 1790, which dealt with aesthetics and teleology.
Together, these three critiques demolished and rebuilt entire domains of philosophy. Kant was doing for philosophy what Copernicus had done for astronomy, fundamentally reorienting how we think about the relationship between mind and world. But while the critiques established Kant's philosophical reputation, our focus today is on works more directly relevant to political philosophy. In 1784, he published an answer to the question, "What is Enlightenment?" a concise, powerful statement of the Enlightenment's mission. In 1785, the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals laid out his ethical theory and the famous categorical imperative. In 1795, Perpetual Peace presented his vision for international relations. And in 1797, the Metaphysics of Morals systematically applied his ethical theory to both law and virtue. Kant lived through tumultuous times. He witnessed the American Revolution and its establishment of constitutional government. He watched the French Revolution begin with hope for rational reform, then descend into the terror that would kill tens of thousands. These events shaped his thinking about how Enlightenment ideals should be implemented, carefully, constitutionally, through reform rather than violent upheaval. Unlike Rousseau, who challenged civilization itself, Kant was thoroughly a figure of the Enlightenment establishment. He was a professor, respected, eventually famous. His life was extraordinarily regular and disciplined, teaching, writing, his famous daily walks, dinner parties where he engaged in philosophical conversation. He never married, dedicating himself entirely to intellectual work. Yet, this seemingly conventional professor in a provincial city produced ideas more radical in their implications than those of more obviously rebellious thinkers. Kant's revolution was quiet but total. He didn't just describe a different political system. He transformed the very foundation on which political philosophy rests, shifting it from questions of power and structure to questions of moral legitimacy and human dignity.
His fundamental project was this: in a world where religious authority was declining, where Enlightenment reason was challenging tradition, where revolutions were overturning old political orders, what could serve as the foundation for morality, law, and political legitimacy? What grounds obligation when divine command and ancient custom no longer compel assent? Kant's answer: human reason itself, operating autonomously according to principles it discovers within its own nature. This was revolutionary. Morality doesn't come from God, custom, sentiment, or consequences. It comes from reason, recognizing what it must do to be consistent with itself. And political order must be structured to respect this rational autonomy that defines human dignity.
In 1784, Kant wrote an essay in response to a question posted by a Berlin journal: "What is enlightenment?" His answer has become one of philosophy's most famous statements, capturing the entire spirit of the age in a few powerful paragraphs. Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. Immaturity is the inability to use one's understanding without guidance from another. This immaturity is self-imposed when its cause lies not in lack of understanding, but in lack of resolve and courage to use it without guidance from another. Sapere aude. Have courage to use your own understanding. That is the motto of Enlightenment. Let's unpack this dense but crucial passage, because it establishes the foundation for everything else in Kant's political philosophy. First, notice what enlightenment is: emergence from immaturity. Kant uses a developmental metaphor. Humanity has been like a child, dependent on guardians to think for them. Enlightenment is growing up, becoming intellectually mature, capable of using your own understanding without someone else guiding you. Second, this immaturity is self-imposed. This is crucial. The problem isn't that we lack of a capacity to think for ourselves. The problem is that we're lazy and cowardly. It's easier to let others think for us. Books can understand for me. Pastors can serve as my conscience. Doctors can decide my diet. I need not think if I can only pay. Others will readily undertake the irksome work for me. Third, the solution requires courage. Sapere aude. Dare to know. Have the courage to use your own understanding. This is the motto of Enlightenment. Borrowed from the Roman poet Horace, but given new meaning. Thinking for yourself isn't just an intellectual exercise. It requires moral courage to question authority, challenge tradition, face uncertainty. But Kant also diagnoses why immaturity persists. There are guardians who benefit from keeping others immature. After the guardians have first made their domestic cattle dumb, and have made certain that these placid creatures will not dare to take a single step without the harness of the cart to which they are confined, the guardians then show them the danger which threatens if they try to go alone.
This is profound social criticism. Those in authority, religious leaders, political rulers, self-appointed experts, have incentives to keep people dependent. They make independence seem dangerous, even impossible. They create rules, dogmas, and formulas that replace thinking, and people, comfortable in their dependence, accept this arrangement. The result is what Kant calls tutelage, being under guardianship like a perpetual child. Religious tutelage, I need not think about religion, my pastor thinks for me. Political tutelage, I need not think about public affairs, others will manage the commonwealth for me. Intellectual tutelage, I need not think at all if I can pay someone to think for me. But here's where Kant makes a crucial distinction that's essential for understanding his political philosophy. He differentiates between the private use of reason and the public use of reason. The private use of reason refers to reasoning in one's official or professional capacity. A military officer must follow orders. A tax collector must enforce tax laws. A pastor must preach church doctrine. In these roles, you're not free to reason however you wish. You have obligations to the institution you serve. The public use of reason, however, refers to reasoning as a scholar addressing the reading public. Here, freedom must be unlimited. The same military officer who must obey orders can publicly argue that military policy is misguided. The tax collector who enforces laws can publicly argue those laws should be changed. The pastor who preaches doctrine can publicly critique theological positions. Moreover, Kant argues that enlightenment is a gradual process, not revolutionary upheaval. A revolution may well put an end to autocratic despotism and to rapacious or power-seeking oppression, but it will never produce a true reform in ways of thinking. Instead, new prejudices, just like the old ones, will serve as a leash to control the great unthinking mass. This is Kant reflecting on both the American and French revolutions. Revolution might change who holds power, but it doesn't automatically create enlightened thinking. That requires education, free discourse, gradual cultivation of autonomy. You can't force people to be enlightened any more than Rousseau's forcing them to be free actually creates freedom. The implication for politics is profound. Legitimate government must not just protect external freedom or represent the general will or check power structurally. It must respect and protect the autonomy of rational beings, their capacity and right to think for themselves, to use their own understanding, to emerge from tutelage. This autonomy, this self-governance of reason, according to principles it recognizes as valid, becomes the foundation of human dignity, and human dignity becomes the foundation of all legitimate political order. Now, we turn to Kant's most famous contribution to philosophy, the categorical imperative, his principle of morality that applies categorically, absolutely, without exception, to all rational beings. This isn't just abstract ethics. It's the foundation on which Kant builds his entire political philosophy, because political legitimacy requires moral justification. Kant begins the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals with a striking claim. It is impossible to think of anything at all in the world, or indeed even beyond it, that could be considered good without limitation except a good will. Not happiness, not pleasure, not power, not even virtue itself apart from will. Only a good will. A will that acts from duty to moral law is unconditionally good. Everything else can be used for bad purposes or can be corrupted, but a will that acts from moral principle is good in itself. But what is this moral law? How do we identify it? Here, Kant faces the problem that had plagued ethics throughout history. Different cultures have different moral codes. Religious traditions offer competing commandments. Consequences are uncertain and subject to manipulation. Emotions vary from person to person. Kant's revolutionary move, morality comes from reason itself, not from any external source. When reason examines what it means to act morally, it discovers a principle already implicit in the very concept of morality, the categorical imperative. Kant formulates this principle in three main ways, though he insists they're ultimately equivalent, different aspects of the same fundamental law. The first formulation is the universal law. Act only in accordance with that maxim, through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. This is sometimes called the formula of universal law. It works like this. Before acting, formulate the maxim, the principle on which you're acting. Then ask, could I consistently will that everyone act on this maxim in all similar circumstances? If not, the action is immoral. Let's use Kant's own example, making a lying promise. Suppose you need money and consider promising to repay it, knowing you won't.
The maxim is, when I need money, I'll make a lying promise to get it. Now, universalize it. What if everyone, when needing money, made lying promises? The institution of promising would collapse. No one would believe promises. The very practice that makes your lying promise effective would be destroyed. This reveals a logical contradiction. You're trying to use an institution, promising, while simultaneously willing the destruction of that institution through universal lying. This is irrational. You're contradicting yourself. Therefore, lying promises are immoral. Notice what Kant is not saying. He's not saying lying is wrong because it has bad consequences, though it might. He's not saying it violates God's command, though it might. He's saying it's wrong because it's logically inconsistent. You cannot rationally will your maxim as universal law. This makes morality objective and rational, not dependent on culture, religion, emotion, or calculation of outcomes. Any rational being, anywhere, anytime, can recognize that certain maxims cannot be universalized without contradiction. The second formulation is humanity as an end. So act that you use humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means. This is the formula of humanity, and it's arguably Kant's most influential contribution to moral and political philosophy. Let's examine it carefully because it grounds the entire concept of human dignity. Kant distinguishes between things that have price and persons who have dignity. Things with price have relative value. They can be exchanged for something of equivalent value. A chair worth $100 can be traded for $100 or something else worth that amount. Price is conditional, relative, comparable. Persons have dignity, absolute, unconditional, incomparable worth. You cannot put a price on a human being. You cannot trade one person for another as equivalents. You cannot calculate whether one person's life is worth more or less than another's based on their characteristics or accomplishments.
Why do persons have this special status? Because they're rational, autonomous beings, capable of recognizing moral law and governing themselves according to it. This rational autonomy is the source of dignity. Now, what does it mean to treat someone merely as a means? It means using them as a tool for your purposes without regard for their own rational autonomy, their own goals, their own capacity to consent. You're treating them like a thing to be used rather than a person to be respected. Examples: lying to someone treats them merely as a means. You're manipulating them, denying them information they need to make rational decisions, using them as a tool for your purposes. Coercing someone treats them merely as a means. You're overriding their will, making them an instrument of your goals. Breaking promises treats them merely as a means. You induce their consent through deception. But notice Kant says never merely as a means. He doesn't say never as a means at all. We use each other as means constantly and legitimately. When I buy coffee from a barista, I'm using them as a means to get coffee. When they sell me coffee, they're using me as a means to earn wages. What makes us legitimate? We're also trading each other as ends. The barista consents to the exchange. I pay a fair price. We're both pursuing our own goals while cooperating. Neither is being manipulated, coerced, or deceived. The key is consent, respect, recognition of the other's rational autonomy. When you treat someone as an end, you recognize their right to make their own decisions, pursue their own goals, govern themselves according to their own rational will. This becomes the foundation of human rights, human dignity, and legitimate political authority. Every person, by virtue of being a rational, autonomous being, has inherent dignity that must be respected. This isn't granted by government, earned through achievement, or conditional on any characteristic. It's inherent in our rational nature.
The third formulation is the kingdom of ends. Act in accordance with the maxims of a member giving universal laws for a merely possible kingdom of ends. This is the formula of autonomy, or the kingdom of ends. It combines elements of the previous two formulations. Imagine a community where every member is both legislator and subject. Everyone participates in making the moral laws that bind everyone equally. No one is above the law or outside it. Each person's autonomy is respected because they're participating in self-legislation. This isn't describing an actual political state. It's a regulative ideal, a way of thinking about moral obligation. When you act morally, you should act as if you were simultaneously making universal law as sovereign legislator and submitting to it as subject citizen. This reveals something profound. Moral autonomy isn't doing whatever you want. It's giving yourself the law, legislating for yourself according to reason. You're free not because you're unconstrained, but because you're following laws you recognize as rational and binding. This concept of autonomy, self-legislation according to rational moral law, becomes central to Kant's political philosophy. Legitimate political authority must respect this autonomy. Government cannot treat citizens as mere means to be manipulated. It must treat them as ends, as rational, autonomous beings capable of self-governance. The categorical imperative isn't just individual ethics. It's the moral foundation for political order. Any legitimate government must be structured to respect human dignity, which means respecting rational autonomy, which means treating citizens as ends capable of self-legislation rather than means to be used.
Let's pause and fully appreciate what Kant has done with the formula of humanity, treating people as ends, never merely as means. This isn't just one ethical principle among others. It's the foundation of the entire modern concept of human rights and human dignity. Before Kant, political philosophy could justify rights and protections through various arguments: natural law from Locke, social contract from Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, utility from emerging utilitarianism, divine command from religious traditions. But these justifications remained vulnerable to challenge or exception. Kant grounds dignity in something that cannot be challenged or accepted, the rational nature that makes us human. If you're a being capable of recognizing moral law and governing yourself according to it, you have dignity. This is categorical, absolute, unconditional. Let's explore the implications. First, dignity is unconditional. You don't earn dignity through achievement, virtue, or social status. You don't lose it through failure, vice, or crime. It's not a matter of degree. No one has more or less dignity than anyone else. Even a criminal who violates others' dignity retains their own dignity. Even the worst person imaginable is still a rational being whose humanity must be respected. This means you cannot justify treating someone as a mere means by pointing to their bad character, their social worthlessness, or any calculation of utility. Their dignity places absolute limits on what can be done to them. Second, dignity grounds inalienable rights. Because dignity is inherent in rational nature, the rights that protect it cannot be taken away, sold, or voluntarily surrendered. This is stronger than Locke's natural rights, which could sometimes be forfeited through wrongdoing or contracted away through consent. Kant's rights are truly inalienable. You cannot enslave yourself even voluntarily. That would be treating your own humanity merely as a means. You cannot consent to being murdered, tortured, or degraded. That would be allowing your dignity to be violated. Some things are simply off the table, regardless of consent or consequences. Third, dignity limits utilitarian calculations. This is perhaps Kant's most important contribution to political philosophy. You cannot sacrifice an individual's dignity for the greater good, the social benefit, the happiness of the majority. Imagine the classic trolley problem. A utilitarian might say, kill one to save five. More happiness, less suffering, greater good. Kant says you cannot treat that one person merely as a means to saving the five. If you actively kill them rather than merely allowing them to die through inaction, you're using them as a tool for your goal of maximizing lives saved. That violates their dignity. This doesn't mean consequences never matter, but it means certain actions are absolutely prohibited regardless of consequences. You cannot torture, even to save lives. You cannot execute the innocent, even to deter crime. You cannot use human subjects in medical experiments without genuine informed consent, even if the research would save millions. Fourth, dignity applies universally. Kant's foundation is reason, which is universal. Any rational being anywhere has dignity. This transcends culture, race, nationality, religion, gender, social status. It creates a cosmopolitan ethics where every human being has equal moral status. This was revolutionary in Kant's time and remains powerful today. It undermines every form of discrimination, hierarchy, or exclusion based on contingent characteristics. Rational autonomy is what matters, and all humans possess it equally. Fifth, dignity creates positive obligations. Treating someone as an end doesn't just mean not using them. It means positively respecting their rational autonomy, supporting their capacity to set and pursue their own goals, facilitating their ability to make informed decisions, protecting the conditions necessary for autonomous choice. This has profound political implications. A government that merely refrains from actively violating rights isn't enough. Government must actively protect and promote the conditions for autonomous living. Education, so people can think for themselves. Freedom of expression, so they can share ideas. Economic security, so they're not desperate. And more.
Sixth, dignity constrains even democracy. Here Kant breaks decisively with Rousseau. Even if the majority agrees, you cannot violate individual dignity. The general will doesn't trump human rights. Democratic majorities cannot legitimately enslave minorities, suppress unpopular speech, or sacrifice individuals for collective benefit. This provides the moral foundation for constitutional limits on democracy, bills of rights, judicial review, protections that majorities cannot override. These aren't obstacles to democracy, they're necessary to ensure democracy respects the dignity of all citizens. Seventh, dignity applies to enemies, criminals, and the undeserving. Perhaps most challenging, even those who violate others' dignity retain their own. Even criminals, even enemies at war, even those we consider morally worthless, all retain inherent dignity that limits what can be done to them. This grounds Geneva Conventions, prohibition of torture, standards for criminal punishment, and humane treatment of prisoners. You can defend yourself, restrain aggressors, punish criminals, but always within limits set by their enduring dignity as rational beings. The political implication? All of this means that legitimate political authority must be grounded in respect for human dignity. Government cannot treat citizens as mere resources to be exploited, tools to be used, or means to achieve collective goals. Every policy, every law, every governmental action must be justifiable to the rational, autonomous beings it affects. This is why Kant says government requires consent, not necessarily explicit historical consent like Locke's problem, but possible rational consent. Could a law be accepted by rational beings who respect each other's dignity? If not, it's illegitimate. This is why Kant requires publicity. Government actions must be capable of being made public and defended publicly. Secret policies that couldn't withstand public scrutiny are presumptively illegitimate because they treat citizens with contempt rather than respect. This is why Kant requires republican government, not in the sense of any particular institutional form, but government under law where citizens participate in legislation and where power is limited by constitutional protections for dignity. The entire architecture of modern human rights law, from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to the Geneva Conventions to national constitutions, rests on this Kantian foundation. Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights doesn't say all human beings are created by God or endowed by nature. It says all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. That's pure Kant. Dignity is the foundation, inherent in our nature as rational beings, the basis of all rights.
Now we reach the crucial bridge. How does Kant move from ethics to politics? How does the categorical imperative, operating in individual moral decisions, translate into principles for legitimate political order? Kant's answer is systematic and rigorous. If human beings have dignity based on rational autonomy, then political institutions must be structured to respect that dignity. This isn't just prudent or convenient, it's a moral necessity, a categorical requirement of justice. Kant distinguishes between internal freedom, moral autonomy, the capacity to govern yourself according to moral law, and external freedom, independence from being constrained by another's choice. Politics concerns external freedom. Government cannot make you moral, that's impossible, because genuine morality requires acting from duty rather than compulsion. But government can and must protect your external freedom, your ability to act without illegitimate constraint from others. The principle of right, Kant's fundamental principle for political philosophy. Any action is right if it can coexist with everyone's freedom according to a universal law, or if on its maxim, the freedom of choice of each can coexist with everyone's freedom in accordance with a universal law. This is the categorical imperative applied to external actions rather than internal motivations. Your freedom is legitimate only insofar as it's compatible with equal freedom for everyone else. This immediately rules out coercion, violence, fraud. Any action that constrains others' freedom cannot coexist with universal freedom. From this foundation, Kant derives three essential attributes that define republican government. First is freedom or independence. Every person has the right to external freedom, independence from being constrained by another's arbitrary choice. No one can legitimately compel you to act according to their will rather than your own. This isn't unlimited freedom. Your freedom is bounded by others' equal freedom. But within that constraint, you're sovereign over yourself. No one has natural authority over you. Second is equality. Every person has equality before the law.
No one has authority to bind others except through law that binds everyone equally. There are no natural masters and slaves, no hierarchy of status that gives some people special rights over others. This doesn't mean equality of wealth or social position. Kant doesn't demand economic leveling. It means equality of legal standing and equal subjection to law. The law applies to rich and poor, powerful and weak, the same way. Third is civil independence. Every person has independence in the sense of being his own master, having legal personality, the status of citizen rather than mere subject. You participate in legislation rather than merely obeying commands. This third attribute is most controversial, and Kant restricts it somewhat, excluding women, servants, and workers without property. Restrictions we would reject today, but that were common in his time. But the principle remains. Legitimate government requires citizens who participate in creating the laws that bind them. Here Kant makes a crucial distinction that separates him from Rousseau. Republican doesn't mean democratic in the sense of direct democracy, where all citizens assemble to vote on everything. For Kant, republican government has two essential features. First, representation. Unlike Rousseau, who insisted sovereignty cannot be represented, Kant argues that representation is necessary and legitimate. In any state beyond the smallest scale, citizens cannot continuously assemble. They must be represented by legislators. Second, separation of powers. Following Montesquieu, Kant insists that legislative, executive, and judicial powers must be divided. But Kant grounds this in moral necessity, not just prudence. Concentration of power inherently threatens to treat citizens as mere means rather than ends.
Why does Kant break with Rousseau on representation? Because he witnessed the French Revolution and its terror. Rousseau's vision of direct popular sovereignty, Kant believed, too easily degenerates into mob rule, where passionate majorities violate individual rights. The very attempt to implement absolute popular sovereignty can lead to tyranny. Kant wants constitutional protections, deliberative representation, institutional stability. These aren't obstacles to legitimate government. They're necessary to ensure government actually respects dignity, rather than just claiming to represent the people's will. Like Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, Kant uses social contract language, but with a crucial difference. He doesn't think there ever was or needs to be an actual historical contract. The social contract is what Kant calls a regulative idea, a principle for evaluating legitimacy, not a historical claim. Government is legitimate if it could be consented to by rational beings who respect each other's dignity and freedom. This is the test. Could this law, this institution, this governmental action be accepted by free and equal rational persons as consistent with their dignity? If not, it's illegitimate, regardless of whether people actually consented historically. This solves problems that plagued previous social contract theories. Locke struggled with the fact that most people never explicitly consented. Rousseau's actual general will was impossible to determine. Kant says we don't need actual consent or actual general will. We need possible rational consent, what rational beings would accept if reasoning correctly. This framework has profound implications for political legitimacy. First, government cannot pursue any goal, even seemingly good goals, in ways that violate dignity. You cannot enslave some for others' benefit. You cannot suppress speech to avoid offense. You cannot coerce religious practice even to promote virtue. Any action that treats citizens merely as means is illegitimate. Second, government must be constitutional, bound by law with power limited and divided. Why? Because unlimited power inevitably treats some citizens as mere means. Constitutional limits aren't optional prudential devices, they're moral requirements.
Third, Government must allow public use of reason, free speech, press, assembly. Why? Because rational beings must be able to think for themselves, critique authority, and participate in public discourse. Suppressing this treats citizens as perpetual children rather than autonomous adults. Fourth, laws must be public and rationally defensible. Secret laws or policies that couldn't withstand public scrutiny failed the test of possible rational consent. If you can't publicly justify a law to those it binds, it's illegitimate. Fifth, punishment must respect dignity. Kant notoriously argues for retributive punishment. Criminals should be punished because they deserve it, not merely to deter others or reform them. Why? Because using criminals merely as examples for deterrence or objects to be fixed through rehabilitation treats them as means. Retributive punishment, paradoxically, respects their dignity by holding them accountable as responsible, rational agents. This doesn't mean punishment can be unlimited. Even criminals retain dignity. Torture, degradation, disproportionate punishment all violate dignity. But punishment proportionate to the crime respects the criminal's status as a rational gang responsible for their choices. Notice how Kant transcends his predecessors. Hobbes gave us absolute sovereignty justified by the need for order. Kant says, no amount of order justifies treating citizens merely as means. Locke gave us natural rights and limited government justified by pre-political entitlements. Kant says rights aren't just pre-political entitlements, but requirements of respecting rational nature. Rousseau gave us popular sovereignty and the general will. Kant says even popular will must respect individual dignity. Majorities can't legitimately violate rights. Montesquieu gave us institutional architecture. Kant says these structures aren't just prudent, but morally necessary to respect autonomy. Kant provides the moral foundation that grounds and limits all political authority. Government isn't just about power, order, contract, or will. It's about respecting the dignity of rational, autonomous beings. And that places absolute limits on what any government, however structured or however popular, can legitimately do.
In 1795, as Europe convulsed with wars following the French Revolution, Kant published Perpetual Peace, a philosophical sketch. This relatively brief work has become one of the most influential texts in international relations theory and the philosophical foundation for international law and institutions. The title itself is somewhat ironic. Perpetual peace was a common phrase for graveyards. Kant is saying, humanity can achieve lasting peace, but only through fundamental transformation of international relations based on moral principles. Kant organizes the work around articles, like a treaty, divided into preliminary articles for immediate steps and definitive articles for permanent principles of perpetual peace. The preliminary articles are steps nations should take immediately. No peace treaty that secretly reserves grounds for future war. No state shall be acquired by another through inheritance, exchange, purchase, or gift, because states aren't property. Standing armies should be gradually abolished because they provoke arms races and make war more likely. No national debt should be contracted for external affairs because debt finances war. No state should interfere violently in another's constitution or government. No state should permit hostile actions that would make future peace impossible. These preliminary articles address immediate causes of war, but the definitive articles establish the permanent foundation for peace based on moral principles. The first definitive article declares, "The civil constitution of every state shall be republican." For Kant, republican government, constitutional, representative, with separation of powers, is morally necessary domestically, but it also makes peace more likely internationally. Why?
Because in republics, citizens bear the costs of war directly. They must fight, pay taxes, suffer devastation. If they decide whether to go to war through representatives, they'll be cautious. They'll exhaust peaceful alternatives before choosing war. In contrast, where one person decides for war, monarchy, dictatorship, the decision maker doesn't bear the costs personally. The monarch can declare war while citizens die and suffer. This makes war more likely. Notice the moral and practical arguments intertwine. Republican government is morally required because it respects dignity, and practically beneficial because it promotes peace. Kant doesn't separate ethics and interests. Respecting dignity is in our rational interest.
The second definitive article states, "The law of nations shall be founded on a federation of free states." This is Kant's most famous and controversial proposal for international relations. He argues that just as individuals leave the state of nature by forming civil society, states must leave international anarchy by forming a federation. But, and this is crucial, not a world government. Kant explicitly rejects world government as dangerously totalitarian. A single global sovereign would have no external check, creating the possibility of global tyranny. Instead, Kant proposes a voluntary federation of free states, a league of nations bound by international law but retaining sovereignty. States would commit to resolving disputes peacefully through law and arbitration rather than war. This federation would have no coercive enforcement power, unlike a state. It would work through moral authority, reciprocal interest, and the gradual spread of republican government, making states more peaceful. Kant was remarkably prescient. The League of Nations in 1920 and United Nations in 1945 attempted to implement this vision. They're federations of sovereign states committed to international law, not world governments. They have serious flaws, but they embody Kant's core idea. States can and should subject themselves to law rather than remaining in lawless international anarchy. The third definitive article proclaims the law of world citizenship shall be limited to conditions of universal hospitality. This is perhaps Kant's most forward-thinking proposal. He argues for cosmopolitan rights that individuals have not as citizens of particular states, but as citizens of the world. Specifically, Kant argues everyone has the right to universal hospitality, the right to visit foreign lands and not be treated with hostility merely for being foreign. This isn't a right to permanent residence because states can control immigration, but it is a right to not be turned away with hostility, to attempt commerce and communication, to be treated as a potential guest rather than automatically as an enemy. The philosophical foundation: all humans share one planet. The Earth's surface is finite and belongs to humanity as a whole. No one has greater original right to any part of it than anyone else. Therefore, we cannot completely exclude others from everywhere. That would deny them any place on Earth. This has profound implications.
First, it grounds refugee rights. People fleeing persecution have a right to seek asylum elsewhere. They can't be simply turned back to face persecution. That violates hospitality. Second, it limits colonialism. Kant explicitly criticizes European colonization. When Europeans visit other lands and conquer, enslave, or dispossess indigenous peoples, they violate both hospitality, which requires peaceful interaction, and dignity by treating others as mere means. Third, it supports international commerce and communication. Trade and cultural exchange aren't just economically beneficial, they're rights. States that completely isolate themselves violate cosmopolitan right. Fourth, it creates universal obligations. We have duties to distant strangers, not just fellow citizens.
We can't be completely indifferent to sufferings elsewhere. Their humanity creates moral claims on us. Notice that all three definitive articles rest on the same foundation: human dignity and rational autonomy. Republican government respects citizens' dignity by treating them as self-legislating rather than mere subjects. The Federation of Free States respects states, really their citizens, autonomy by establishing law rather than conquest as the principle of international relations. Cosmopolitan right respects the dignity of all humans as rational beings, not just fellow citizens. Peace isn't just absence of war or balance of power as realism would have it. It's a moral achievement, the establishment of rightful relations among rational beings who respect each other's dignity. Kant is remarkably optimistic about eventual perpetual peace, but his optimism is complex. He doesn't think humans will suddenly become virtuous. He thinks historical forces combined with moral principles make progress likely. First, war becomes more destructive over time. Eventually, its costs will outweigh any benefit, making peace rational even for selfish states. Second, commerce creates interdependence. States that trade together have incentives to maintain peace and establish stable legal relations. Third, republican government gradually spreads. As more states become republican, they're more peaceful toward each other, and they serve as examples that others may follow. Fourth, public opinion matters increasingly. Enlightenment and free press mean citizens can critique warmongering leaders, creating domestic pressure for peace. Fifth, injustice to refugees in Europe affects moral consciousness globally. This creates pressure for universal standards of right. Kant doesn't guarantee progress, but he sees historical trends that, combined with moral imperatives, make perpetual peace possible and increasingly likely.
Kant's vision remains the framework for international justice. The United Nations embodies his Federation of Free States. International criminal courts, from Nuremberg to the International Criminal Court, apply universal standards of right across borders. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights asserts cosmopolitan standards. Refugee conventions protect the right to seek asylum. The European Union experiments with deeper federation among republican states. These institutions are imperfect, frequently violated, often ineffective, but they represent attempts to instantiate Kant's vision, replacing power politics with legal relations, respecting state sovereignty while asserting universal human rights, creating institutions for peaceful dispute resolution. The fundamental Kantian questions remain. Can international relations be governed by law rather than force? Can states respect each other's autonomy while protecting human rights? Can we balance sovereignty with cosmopolitan obligations? Can moral principles constrain interest-driven politics? These aren't resolved, but Kant gave us the framework for thinking about them, grounding international justice in the same principle as domestic justice: respect for human dignity, universal and absolute, that limits what any power, individual or collective, domestic or foreign, can legitimately do.
We've traced Kant's remarkable intellectual journey from Enlightenment as autonomous thinking through the categorical imperative as universal moral law to human dignity as the foundation of political legitimacy, to republican government as moral necessity, to perpetual peace as the goal of international relations. Let's step back and appreciate what Kant accomplished and why he remains indispensable for understanding modern politics and ethics. Before Kant, political philosophy asked, who should rule? How should government be structured? What makes authority legitimate? These questions received various answers: social contract, natural law, divine right, consent, utility. Kant shifted the foundation entirely. Politics must answer to morality. And morality isn't about consequences, tradition, or command. It's about respecting rational autonomy. the capacity that makes us human and gives us dignity. This transformed political philosophy from empirical description and pragmatic design to moral evaluation and normative constraint. Government isn't just about maintaining order or protecting interests. It's about respecting the dignity of rational beings, and that places absolute limits on what government can do, regardless of whether it maintains order or serves interests. Every major political philosopher since Kant either builds on or reacts against his framework. Hegel takes Kant's autonomy and tries to realize it historically through dialectical development. Marx critiques Kant as bourgeois ideology, masking material power relations. But Marx's own vision of human emancipation borrows Kantian themes of autonomy and dignity. John Rawls revives Kantian political philosophy in the 20th century, grounding his theory of justice in respect for persons as free and equal rational beings. Robert Nozick develops libertarian Kantianism, arguing that respecting autonomy requires minimal state intervention. Jürgen Habermas builds discourse ethics on Kantian foundations, arguing that legitimate law emerges from rational discourse among free and equal persons. Christine Korsgaard defends and develops Kantian ethics, showing its contemporary relevance. Even critics who reject Kant engage with his framework. Communitarian critics argue Kant ignores social context. Feminist critics argue he privileged masculine rationality. Postmodern critics question universal reason, but they're all responding to the dominance of Kantian thinking.
Kant's ideas aren't just philosophical abstractions, they're embedded in the institutional and legal structures of the modern world. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948 states in Article 1, "All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights." That's pure Kant. Dignity as foundation, inherent in human nature, basis of all rights. The German Basic Law from 1949 declares in Article 1, "Human dignity shall be inviolable. To respect and protect it shall be the duty of all state authority." Post-Holocaust Germany grounded its constitution explicitly in Kantian dignity. International humanitarian law through Geneva Conventions protects even enemies and criminals because they retain dignity. Prohibition of torture, even of terrorists, rests on Kantian grounds. You cannot treat people merely as means to security. Bioethics with informed consent requirements in medicine comes from respect for autonomy. You cannot experiment on people, even for beneficial research, without genuine consent. That's treating them as ends. Criminal justice debates over the death penalty, prison conditions, and rehabilitation versus retribution all invoke Kantian themes of dignity and respect for rational agency. Consider how Kant's framework helps analyze modern issues. When is it legitimate to use artificial intelligence to make decisions affecting people? Kant would ask, does it respect their autonomy or treat them as mere data points? Can decisions be explained and justified to those affected? Mass surveillance treats citizens as potential threats to be monitored, rather than autonomous beings to be respected. Even if it enhances security, does it violate dignity by denying presumption of trustworthiness? Social media algorithms that manipulate behavior treat users as means to engagement and profit rather than ends capable of rational decision. Even if users consent, can genuine consent exist when manipulation is invisible? Extreme wealth disparities might not directly violate dignity, but they can undermine the material conditions necessary for autonomy. If poverty forces people into dependence or denies them education needed for autonomous choice, dignity is indirectly violated. Do we have cosmopolitan obligations to distant stranger and future generations affected by climate change on our emissions? Kant's universal respect for rational nature suggests yes. Geography and time don't limit moral obligations. Can it ever be legitimate
to delegate life and death decisions to autonomous weapons and machines? Kant would likely say no. That treats human targets as mere objects, rather than beings whose dignity requires human judgment.
Kant's framework faces serious challenges. Critics argue Kant's universal rational principles ignore concrete circumstances, cultural context, particular relationships that matter morally. Communitarians say Kant's autonomous individual ignores how we're constituted by communities, traditions, social bonds. The absoluteness of dignity sometimes conflicts with intuitions. If lying could save lives, must you tell the truth? Kant says yes. Most people say no. Is dignity a Western concept being imposed universally? Do all cultures recognize individual rational autonomy as morally fundamental? Kant tells us what constraints exist, but not how to design specific institutions or resolve conflicts between rights. Kant famously argued you must never lie, even to save a life. If a murderer asks where your friend is hiding, you must tell the truth. This seems absurd to most people, revealing tensions in absolute duties. Despite these challenges, Kant remains indispensable. Why? Because he articulated the most powerful moral foundation for political legitimacy we have. Other foundations face even greater problems. Utility can justify sacrificing individuals for collective benefit. Natural law lacks clear content without theological commitments. Social contract struggles with actual consent and binding future generations. Tradition and culture provide no grounds for critical evaluation. Pure power politics abandons morality entirely. Kant's foundation, respect for rational autonomy as the source of dignity, provides something unique. A universally accessible through reason, non-arbitrary, not dependent on culture or power, substantive, provides real constraints, basis for evaluating political legitimacy. Every modern democracy implicitly invokes this framework when asserting universal human rights, constitutional protections, limits on majority power. We might not use Kantian language, but we're relying on Kantian foundations.
Kant doesn't resolve all questions. He leaves us with enduring challenges. How do we balance individual autonomy with collective action on global problems like climate change? How do we respect cultural diversity while maintaining universal human rights? How do we protect dignity in an age of artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and digital surveillance? How do we fulfill cosmopolitan obligations in a world of sovereign states and scarce resources? How do we make Kantian ideals politically realistic rather than merely aspirational? These are questions Kant raised but couldn't fully answer. We're still working on them, but Kant gave us the framework: human dignity as absolute foundation, rational autonomy as the source of that dignity, respect for persons as ends as the limiting principle of all political authority.
Thank you for joining me on Timeless Thinkers. If you found this exploration valuable, please like, subscribe, and share. Leave a comment with your thoughts. Next time, we'll explore another philosopher who shaped our world. Until then, keep thinking, keep questioning, keep learning.